Welcome to Santai Senja, a podcast produced by the International Movement for a Just World.
Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of Santai Senja. My name is Hassanal, the program coordinator of the International Movement for a Just World. And like I said, this is the first episode of what we hope is to be a series of discussions together with Just members, friends of Just, and our executive committee members, discovering a range of topics about what Just is about, what we discuss about, and the topics and issues that we highlight in the realm of geopolitics and, of course, international relations. And with me today to commemorate the first episode of this series is Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. Dr. Chandra has written extensively and spoken extensively on many topics ranging from geopolitics, on hegemony, on interfaith and intercivilizational relations, and on social justice. As he is the president of the International Movement for a Just World, and therefore he is the best person to also discuss about what we are talking about today. Dr. Chandra, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
So, since we are talking about today the topic on the origins of Just as an organization, and you've been with Just for the longest, since its inception, am I correct to say that?
Yes.
So I wanted to ask Chandra, I think a lot of people might want to know, the first topic is, what is the origins of Just? What sparked the idea that inspired you and a few others to collectively come up with the concept of the International Movement for a Just World? Do you want to share that?
Yeah, okay. Yes. Thank you for doing the series. I hope it will help to enlighten all of us, including those of us who will be talking about Just, that will help to enlighten us about Just's role and its future, and the future of global politics. Now, Just was established formally in 1992. That's almost 30 years ago now. Mm. And it is significant that the idea of Just came up at the end of the Cold War, because that is linked to the origins of Just. Why do I say that? With the end of the Cold War, it became obvious to some of us that we may be entering a new phase in international relations. And what is the new phase? The phase of a unipolar world. It is obvious to us that the US and the West, that saw itself as the victor in the Cold War, it would seize the moment to perpetuate its dominance, to perpetuate its hegemony. That this is what was going to happen with the end of the Cold War. We didn't believe all the cock and bull about we're going to inaugurate a new era of peace and so on. We knew that what we were going to witness was the politics of a unipolar world. And that unipolar world, of course, would be headed by the US and its allies. And they would want to shape the world according to their own design, according to their own agenda. We felt, that's myself and a few friends in Penang, because Penang is where we established Just in 92. We felt that people should realize what this unipolar world is all about, and what it was going to lead to, its consequences, its disastrous impact. They should be aware of it. And the one way of making them aware was through civil society. by establishing a group within the arena of civil society that will address the issues and challenges linked to a unipolar world. The others who felt that way, my friends, there were also individuals like me who were in the NGO movement. There was the late Mr. Muhammad Idris. There was Anwar Fazal, who is a very well-known consumer advocate at the global level. And then there was Muhyiddin Abdul Qadir, also involved in consumer activism, and the brother of Mr. Idris. He's now, as we know, the president of the Consumer Association of Penang. Then there was Fatima Idris, the daughter of Mr. Idris, also involved in social activism. So the five of us, we were the ones who established JUST in 1992. The actual date of the inauguration of JUST was the 1st of August 1992. We set it up as a private trust. JUST was established as a private trust. And the goal was very simple, as the name suggests, to work towards a just world, to establish the intellectual and moral foundations of a just world. That was the aim. It was not aimed at changing the political landscape. It was not a political organization in any way. It was basically an organization committed to thinking and awareness, making people aware, getting them to understand issues. In that sense, it was intellectual to some extent, but not intellectual in the ordinary sense of the term, because it was concerned about activism, ideas that would serve humankind. It was an attempt to understand what was happening in society and to act, to do what we could through forums and seminars and writings and networking and mobilizing and so on. That was what JUST was going to do.
So in that case, Chandra, because since we are talking about how JUST came about in the foundations of what was essentially a Cold War era, and a lot of the things that happened was, like you mentioned, that the United States and quite a few other global powers were vying to actually create a, what one also consider as a hegemonic structure that basically controls and consolidates powers based upon its own set of rules and everything. So I can imagine that when trying to shed a light on these things and trying to essentially create awareness about the kind of unilateral monopolization of power by superpowers themselves who seek to dominate and control, there will be a lot of challenges that JUST would have obviously faced throughout the years since its establishment. Because we're talking about not, like you said, not just an intellectual foundation, but an intellectual foundation that's also very active and also very, involved in the process as well. So clearly there must have been some friction. Was there any friction, or was there any challenges that JUST has faced throughout the years since its inception?
We faced numerous challenges. The most obvious challenge, of course, is the reality of a unipolar world, that we were faced with this challenge of a unipolar world, one nation and nations aligned to it, dominating the entire globe. And that was how people looked at international relations. This was the reality that confronted us, and it was not easy because most people saw it as something normal, something to be expected. They were willing to live with this, and they didn't see anything wrong in the fact that You had, for instance, United Nations that was dominated by the United States, that there were 5 members of the Security Council at a veto. And that was a reflection of the situation immediately after the Second World War. These were the victors of the Second World War. And of course, at the head of the victory party was the United States. And they had set up the UN, a Security Council that reflected their interests, and a Security Council that was determined to preserve and perpetuate the interests of the dominant powers. That was the reality. And when I say this is a reality, what I mean is that it's not just politics, economics, and culture, and social relations, in almost every sphere. This is the reality. People were not even aware of it. That there was dominance and control, what I have often described as hegemony. Hegemony is control and dominance. And here we were, a small group, small insignificant group, trying to get people to understand this, to see it in a critical manner, to fight this hegemony, not through arms and not through politics, but to fight it through one's consciousness, one's awareness, that we as citizens of the world could live in a more just world where there was equality, justice, fairness, where human beings could maintain their dignity and human beings could live in a world where there was social justice. That is what we were working towards. So it was tough, very tough. The mainstream media was against us. And against many other groups that spoke this sort of language. The universities, even when they taught international relations, did not give attention to realities of this sort. How many international relations courses are there in the world where they discuss hegemony as a topic? It should be a whole syllabus, because it's so important. It is the dominant feature of global politics. You did international relations, no, Sana? Did your international relations program emphasize hegemony?
See, that's the thing as well, because back in the day when I was in uni, it also tried to touch on issues, but they never explicitly called it hegemony. Because they've always tried to skirt around the topic about that there are powers at play, there's all these other forces and things like that. So they tried to make it look like a very superpowers vying against each other, very realist politics sort of settings. But when it came to talking about directly what the US is doing, how it controls narratives, how it controls the situation, how it forces other people. They don't talk about these things, how the US forces others to actually comply or suffer the consequences essentially. But they don't really focus on these things. So I agree with you on this one, where not a lot of universities carry on about international relations, especially in overseas institutions. But I also find, and correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but I also find that when it came to our domestic politics, there was a large degree of not just ignorance, but apathy towards the situation. When it came to our local politics, when it came to our local populace, when they talk about things that happen in the US and other countries as well, we don't really want to talk about it. Do you see that as a thing in our local situation over here as well?
Yeah, well, I think that is a very big challenge that we all face, that within the domestic sphere, there isn't much interest in international relations to start with. And that's true all over the world. Many years ago, a survey was done on people's interest in international relations, and it ranked very low. There's not much interest. They would be interested in something happening within their own locality, maybe within their own country, election perhaps, or something to do with some big event within their own country. But global issues, global challenges, there wasn't much interest, very little concern. And that is the big challenge we've always faced domestically. Lack of interest, the lack of commitment. You can get 20 people to be actively involved in a local issue, but when you tell them that there is this international challenge and they should try to be interested, they should work towards its resolution, they will not be too concerned. There isn't that sort of enthusiasm. I mean, you take a thing like what's happening now, Ukraine. There's some report, because Ukraine has affected all of us. Food prices are going up. Many reasons behind it. It's not just the war in Ukraine, but the war in Ukraine is one of the reasons. Inflation and its consequences, people are a bit concerned. But there isn't that much concern as one would be concerned with, say, a local issue. One would be concerned about, say, an election within a small political party, as if that is going to impact upon our future much more than many of these things that are happening globally. So I think it is this lack of interest which is part of the problem at the domestic level. At the international level, as I said, one doesn't even know that there is this creature called hegemony one has to address. So this is why I think a body like ours, NGO like ours, faces major challenges right from the word go. You're dealing with a lack of awareness. You're dealing with a whole atmosphere that doesn't encourage this sort of thinking.
I agree. I also think that if I were to add to that, I think that people aren't aware about local issues are very easy to perceive because you can see them directly impacting us. But a lot of people, I feel, do not understand that there are broader issues and larger geopolitical issues at play that ultimately, in some form or another, will affect you. Because, like, the war in Ukraine is one of the examples that you noted about how it essentially has increased wheat prices. They can see that, so maybe they'll have an understanding of that situation, but they don't see how other dynamics and other forces in geopolitics are actually working that does impact them, like America's continued attempts to contain China, for example, how that affects the economy. There's so much strings being pulled around that people just don't perceive it, and that's why I feel that organizations like Just, like you mentioned as well, it's important to highlight how these things, do affect us and what it means for us in the long run as well.
True.
So in that case, I want to segue into the next question, and because while back in the day, I do feel a lot of people weren't as interested because coming out of the Cold War, people were looking for some degree of stability. Here comes a superpower that says that I will control the world, I'll be the sheriff of the world, and I'll take care of everything. And then completely, essentially, a lot of people have now come to an agreement, I feel, that they didn't do it very well, considering the situations like happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan, like mostly focusing on the United States. And a lot of people, I feel now, are coming to terms with the idea of their colonial history, especially those countries that have experienced, colonialism, especially from the British Empire. They are now coming towards understanding what the effects of colonialism has and how it's influenced contemporary hegemony. So I suppose in that case, I wanted to ask, considering that, what is Just's relevancy now coming into the more contemporary setting?
It's a good question, and it's important that you linked it with colonialism. To understand hegemony, or to put it very simply, to understand the dominance and control of global politics, economics, everything at the global level by a certain superpower and countries allied to that superpower. To understand this phenomenon called hegemony, we have to understand colonialism. So I'm glad that you alluded to colonialism. Because if you look at what had happened at the beginning of this phase of hegemonic power. The Second World War ended. The winners of the war, led by the United States, they decided that they would ensure that the world is under their control. So look at the things they did. You're very much aware of this, Hassan. The UN was established in their interest. Don't forget, it was actually in the United States it was established, San Francisco, and then later, of course, headquartered in New York, but apart from location, they wanted to make sure that they would be in control of the United Nations, meaning by which global politics, right? And global security. They established, as we know, the IMF. Around the same time, they established the World Bank. They do these things. And they established something known as GATT, which has now been replaced by the WTO. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was to control global trade. And then, of course, replaced now with the World Trade Organization. They were in total control. And don't forget that they control the media, most of the media, and as we were made aware of this years ago, that if you look at 80 to 90% of global news about the world flows through the arteries of Western channels. Reuters, UPI, AP, Associated Press, all of them. They are the main channels.
It goes through all of them.
And if you look at the leading newspapers of the world, which are very often referred to as the sources for our news, you look at radio stations, my parents, for instance, grew up believing in everything that the BBC said. It was the paragon of truth for them. And then, of course, you have television, CNN. It's the most important global source of television news. So they're in control. In other words, they determine how we see the world. They determine how we understand the world in its affairs and so on. And even if you look at some so-called alternatives, actually they're not really alternatives now, Sana, as you and I know. For instance, like Al Jazeera, for instance, Al Jazeera is a product of the BBC and the Western TV media. And when it comes to very critical issues, the stand that Al Jazeera will take. Now, the good thing with Al Jazeera is they've got a lot of interesting documentaries. That's good. That enlighten people, that make them aware of what is happening. But in terms of news and global politics, economics, and so on, they toe the line.
Yes, they do.
And even if you look at Global China Television Network, don't think for one moment that it is truly independent. It's not. If you look at the way it slants its news and so on, again, it fits in with that paradigm. So articulating the alternative is a great challenge. And we have to continue to do that, because whatever it is, we cannot deny that changes are taking place. People are becoming more aware, and they have become more aware for 3 reasons. And this, I think, is very, very important for us to keep in mind as a body concerned about a more just world. What are the 3 sources? First is because of dramatic events that have happened, that have shaken them and woken them up. And of all the events after the Second World War, that has had a very huge impact upon global consciousness, actually, is the Iraq War. The Iraq War has had a much greater impact than Vietnam and whatever has happened since. Because if you look at the Iraq War, according to one analysis, at least 50 million people were involved in opposing the war in different forms, street demonstrations, candlelight processions, writing letters to the media, all those things. 50 million people involved. It was a massive movement. Of course, it did not succeed in stopping the war, but it succeeded in something else. It succeeded in delegitimizing the war. All across the board. He delegitimized the war, and it's the people who stood up. And the mainstream media, they were not there. I mean, I was in this tribunal on the Iraq War, established by a number of NGOs, many of them actually led by women. And I was a member of the jury, which met in Istanbul, in Turkey. Now it's pronounced differently, right? The new pronunciation for the country. So I was there in the tribunal in 2005. And the chief juror was Arundhati Roy, who won the jury. And then you had Richard Falk leading the prosecution in that case. And, the BBC blocked out everything. The BBC, they were all there. They knew what was happening, no coverage. CNN, all the others, no coverage at all. And yet it was a very important event where ordinary citizens were sitting in judgment of what had happened, the Iraq War. So the Iraq War was a major turning point in terms of consciousness. And why did it have that sort of impact? Because it was such an unjust war. As the late Edward Said said, the most immoral war in history was the Iraq War. It was basically to gain control over oil, strategic routes, and to strengthen the position of Israel. That was the purpose behind the war. And all the camouflage about weapons of mass destruction and how evil this man called Saddam Hussein was and so on. But the real reasons were Israel, oil, and the strategic routes. And people were revolted by what had happened. And I think that's one very important factor. A dramatic event like this has that sort of impact, and people will be allowed to forget that this had happened, you see. Now, the second reason why I think Iraq was so important was because of the killings that preceded it, that took place during the war and after the war. It is just utterly unjust, it is hypocritical what had happened. And don't forget, 650,000 children died as a result of sanctions even before the war started in 2003. And that had a very big impact. Can you imagine the late Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, US, saying that it was worth it. The 650,000 children. That was another factor, the colossal scale of the killings, the injustice, and so on was another factor. And the third factor was, I think, the role played by various organizations and individuals in raising consciousness before and during and after that helped. That was also an important factor. And I would like to mention here the role played by Pope John Paul II. He spoke up. He made sure that the Catholic countries that were in the UN Security Council at that time, they would not support the war. And so people like him, sort of a moral conscience, they played a role. And a number of others, but also various organizations and so on. So I think these were reasons why the Iraq War is so important. It's a turning point in global history. I don't think it would be possible to mobilize that way another time in the future if something like this happens, because I think those who are against this type of alternative thinking, who are against people knowing the truth about their wars and their hegemony and their dominance, they will not allow this sort of thing to happen. But still, the consciousness is developed, and that consciousness is very important. Don't forget that, a few years later, Syria.
That's right.
Consciousness in Britain was one of the reasons why the US could not go to war, because Britain was its closest partner. They were all prepared to go to war. Remember, Sanal, I mean, you also played a role in distributing some of our analysis on what was happening in Syria.
I remember that. I remember there was a lot of pushback against it as well.
That's right. Push back against it. So I think that consciousness has developed, and that is something which is there, and it will remain for a long time. We must keep on developing it.
That's true. Yeah. So I suppose that's where just plays a relevancy, because now, like you mentioned, since the Iraq War, since the invasion of Iraq, with all the lies, the deceit about weapons of mass destruction and everything, I assume that a lot of people now came to realize it. Like you mentioned, a lot of consciousness has grown from it, and people have gotten more cynical about those who claim to power, those who cling to power, and those who continuously craft fictitious narratives to justify why they should be able to go to these wars. And that's pushing back against them. And you can see that has a result on their current, the current society that's forming, especially if I were to say in America. There was a reason why Trump won, for example. There was a reason why a lot of them were pushing back against the main government. It's because they lost trust, because they've seen the lies that they put forward to. And I suppose I can ask for your view on this, Chandra. This is where I suppose where Just is going to, the vision for where Just plays in the future and in the contemporary setting currently, is that we have to be the voice that essentially is like the rock, the anchor, to keep people grounded to what is the reality that is going on right now, so that people continuously to grow this thing, to grow consciousness about what's going on, so that they can learn to be more conscionable, so more moral about their actions, be more aware of the things that are going on.
Yes. Yeah, undoubtedly. I mean, you have put it in a capsule in a correct way. That's what it's all about. We have to continue to develop consciousness, and we have to do it in spite of all the obstacles that we face, both obstacles which are internal and also those which are within the larger environment. And it's not just us, Hassan. There are hundreds, maybe a few thousand groups like ours all over the world who are doing what should be done.
Yep.
And we may not be working together on each and every issue, but we are aware of what is happening. We do network sometimes. And one of the major activities of Just is actually networking. We support other causes, and they support us when it comes to certain causes which are important to us. So it is working together on all these causes that really matter. So for instance, if you look at what is happening now in the world, and we try to connect the dots, because this is what I think NGOs like Just and other similar NGOs should be doing. We should make people aware, we make them connect the dots, understand what the underlying motives are, why things are happening the way they are happening, and so on. You take, for instance, this whole thing about Ukraine. All right, there is Ukraine. Why did it happen? Is it because someone suddenly became mad and decided to go to war? Because he's a madman? I mean, no one is going to buy that sort of rubbish. We know that, yes, Ukraine is a product of expansionism, of NATO's expansionism, of the West's expansionism, the military expansionism. Because at the end of the Cold War, the hope and the understanding was that there wouldn't be this sort of expansionism, military expansionism. After all, the Warsaw Pact, which was established as a response to NATO, was dissolved at the end of the Cold War. These were all those countries that were together with the Soviet Union at that time. It was dissolved. And they didn't ask NATO to be dissolved, but they were hoping that NATO would not expand. But not only NATO not dissolved, so it continued expansion. In fact, it flew into NATO members that were part of the Warsaw Pact at one time. They made them part of NATO, and they continue to do that. So you continue to do that, like what the present Pope Francis said. It was a very nice analogy that he used, which you'll be aware of. He said it's like you unleash a dog, and the dog keeps barking, in front of your door. And suddenly you find that the person who is inside the house, he comes out with a shotgun because he can't stand the barking of the dog. So you have to take into account this barking of the dog. You keep on, sort of pushing right up to the Russian borders. And now you look at what's happened. Sweden and Finland countries are supposed to be neutral historically, right? Sweden is not even a neighbor of Russia, but Finland is. Finland has a very long border that it shares with Russia. They have decided to join NATO. You're making the situation worse.
Yeah.
This is the problem, so they keep on pushing, that. Now, you see why this is happening. Look at what the US and its allies, especially the US, but its allies in our part of the world, like Australia, right? And perhaps even one or two others, Japan, Look at what they're doing. They are increasing the temperature in this fight against China.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, that's another factor.
Yeah, so another corridor that they've opened up, there's another, area that they're interested in controlling. So China. So it is Russia, China. Yeah. And so this hegemon is hoping that by taking on these two powers, they'll be able to control the world.
Yep, exactly.
Don't realize what the consequences are going to be,
Yep, that actually sums it up right there, right? Because at the end of the day, no matter what, even from the Cold War, outside of the Cold War, it's never changed. They just want to control everything. Yeah, that's right. Correct. They want to control everything. And so when they find that something independent is developing, and they react immediately. I mean, this is why, if you look at why the United States of America, such a big country, powerful country in theoretical sense, why one would want to crush little Cuba, small little Cuba, 90 kilometers from the US border. Why do you want to go and crush Cuba? All that Cuba wants to do is to establish its own system and develop in its own way. It's no threat to the United States of America, but they cannot tolerate Cuba. And right through the last few decades, ever since Cuba emerged in 1959 as an independent sovereign nation state, not prepared to be a lackey of the US, they've been wanting to crush Cuba. They want to crush Bolivia. They want to crush Venezuela. All countries in their neighborhood, which is something very important for us to keep in mind, Sana, because in the attempt to crush China, to finish off China, of course, they won't be able to do it, but in their desire to achieve this, Southeast Asia would be part of their target. And the countries of Southeast Asia will be drawn into this, meaning by which those of us who are here in ASEAN, and they're not going to allow countries in ASEAN to be independent, to, really sovereign. They're not going to allow. They'll find a way to erode autonomy, all in the pursuit of containing China, in pursuit of perpetuating their power. Yes. And if I were to interject, sorry, it's just you see, ultimately, I think that's where it sums it up, because going back to our initial point as well, a lot of people aren't aware of these ramifications, of how ultimately all these geopolitical forces coming into play, it also does affect us in many different ways, in different reaches as well. It does affect us no matter what. So I suppose if, since we're also running out of time, I wanted to also ask, is that the vision of where justice is going to be in the future, where our relevancy is? We will continue, we have to, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not a matter of if, I mean, we have to continue to speak out. We have to continue to highlight about what's going on a larger geopolitical scale, because it does affect us. It doesn't just affect human justice. It affects our position, our security, and ultimately the consciousness of the human soul, to put it very dramatically. But the conscious of the human soul is at stake over here, because we continuously don't address it and see how far its ramifications will be into the future. Now they're seeing it. But ultimately, what are we going to do to, address the situation? So I think that's where we probably can end on this one, because just obviously, you've mentioned the history of what started from the onset of the Cold War, going into the various issues that has cropped up throughout the years, and ultimately as well, what we are going to have to be facing, because so long as the hegemon has its grander ambitions and it doesn't care about what it steps on, I think that's where just might have its place. So I want to ask Dr. Chandra in that case, as maybe a part of a closing statement. maybe do you have any messages or you want remarks to our current members, to our future members as well?
Yeah. Well, to put it very simply, if you want to focus upon a particular goal as an NGO, as a body concerned about raising consciousness, our goal should be to ensure that we move in the direction of a multipolar world. The unipolar world that they lorded over, the hegemon and his allies, that's gone. But how this multipolar world will develop, it's not certain. But there is every possibility that a multipolar world will develop, largely because of China. And of course, the other countries, Russia, there is Iran, Turkey, you have countries like Venezuela and other countries, a number of countries which are coming up. They don't want to live in a unipolar world. All these countries and the people who live in these countries, they want a multipolar world where each and every human being can protect and enhance his or her own dignity. That is what is important. Where you are not dictated to, where you are not a cog in the wheel, where you're not used for a particular purpose, you know?
Yep.
You are able to contribute towards social justice, look after your own resources, look after the interests of your own people. I mean, something very straightforward. And that is what we should aim to achieve. And I think now people can see this. Huh? If you see that they're not bothered about what is happening at the global level, you're not bothered about geopolitics, well, geopolitics is not going to leave you alone.
No.
You may not want to be concerned about this, but it's not going to leave you alone. It didn't leave you alone in the Ukraine war, that's geopolitics. The price of wheat is affected. 43% of Egyptians, they get their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. Now they can't afford these things. You see, this is the whole thing, that it affects us. It affects employment. All these countries, employment is affected by trends like this. Currency changes. The US currency and what they're trying to do to the ruble and all the rest of it, it affects all of us. So you can't run away from these things, and we have to understand these things better. It is a pity that we have such limited resources trying to develop this sort of understanding, and we only wish more and more people would be part of this struggle, because this is a task for all of us. We've all got to work together. It's for the whole of humankind to work together to restore humanity, defend our humanity against hegemony. That's what it is.
Exactly. So I think that's a good place to sum up our discussions for today. There's definitely a lot more topics that we can definitely cover on, especially when we go and explore more into the nuances of geopolitics and hegemony, especially, and other topics related to it. So I want to thank Dr. Chandra for joining me today for our discussion.
Thank you.
And I hope that we will have more of these discussions in the coming months, because we plan for the Santai Senja series to be a monthly installment. So to everyone, thank you for joining us. And for those who want to comment, please feel free to do so on whatever platform that you might be hearing this on. And we will see you next time on the next episode of Santai Senja. Thank you, Dr. Chandra, for joining us.
Thank you. And I think we must, you and I and all of us here, also thank Jaspal Kaur, because she is the one who initiated this idea of Santai Senja, Thank you.
That's right. Thank you also, Dr. Jaspal, if you're hearing this. All right. So thank you, Dr. Chandra, and we'll see everyone next time.